Hello everyone, I am Dr. Susengfa Gogoi. Welcome you all to another episode on e-Politica. Today, in our channel, I am going to present on one of the important aspects of contemporary world politics, most particularly associated with the idea of Cold War. Today's topic of discussion is arenas of Cold War. Here, we would mainly focus on the Cuban Missile Crisis, impacts of such crisis, and balance of power measures taken during the conflict or crisis time. Without a further ado, let us begin. The objectives of today's module is to learn the arenas of conflict during Cold War, to look at the major crises during the Cold War, to highlight on the Cuban Missile Crisis, to understand the consequences of this crisis, to discuss about the initiatives taken to control the arms race during the conflict situation. Before we move on, the details of these objectives, let us have a very quick recap of the things that we have talked in Module 8 and Module 9. Those who have already watched our previous modules, they could relate to this topic. So what we have discussed in the previous modules. In the previous module, we have talked about the meaning of Cold War, why Cold War had happened, what were the regions of Cold War, what is two power blocks, why the world was divided into two power blocks, who were the member countries of these two power blocks, why the smaller nations joined the bipolar politics, why the big nations were dependent on the smaller nations. So these are the questions that we have tried to answer in the previous module on the channel. Now, today we will talk about the arenas of conflict or crisis during Cold War, which were in continuation with the previous module, module number 8 and 9. Those who were new to the channel, kindly go back to the playlist to find out the module 8 and 9. All these modules are also available in Assamese. Now, when we talk about the arenas of Cold War, the very idea of Cold War, as we have discussed previously, was a war of nerves, the war of ideology between two dominant countries. Both of these countries, during the Cold War time, they were trying to influence or enhance their area of sphere in both Europe and other non-European countries. Therefore, it was noticed that Cold War has an immense impact almost all the areas of the world, both directly as well as indirectly. Now, when we talk about Cold War, it is also very important to understand that the very idea of Cold War was not only limited to Europe alone. Although at the beginning, the major crisis in Cold War was happened mostly in Europe, but slowly and steadily it has also started engulfing the other parts of the world, including those countries who have also newly emerged from their colonial masters. Therefore, when we talk about arenas of Cold War, we are basically talking about the areas in where the Cold War was impacted or Cold War was noticed. Now, when we talk about the crisis that happened during Cold War, there are some major area of crisis that happened between the superpowers, that is USA and USSR. For example, some of them are Cuban Missile Crisis, that was happened in the year 1962. The war in Korea, many people also call it as Korean War. It happened during 1950 to 53. The Berlin Crisis in the year 1958 to 62. The Congo Crisis that happened during 1960. The Vietnam War, which started in 1955, ends until 1975. Then Soviet-Afghan War, which happened during 1979 and 1989. So from these crises, one thing is very clear to understand, that during the time of Cold War, the impact of Cold War was felt on almost all the European countries and also in some parts of Asia. Therefore, these crises were taken into consideration. Now, when we talk about the arenas of Cold War, more particularly, we would mostly give importance to one crisis which was given in your syllabus in the higher secondary class 12 or CBSE class 12 syllabus. That is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, let us talk a bit about what do we mean by Cuban Missile Crisis in details. Now, as you all know, Cuba has been one of the most important neighbors of United States of America because of its geopolitical connection with US. It is the most neighboring country of US who has always been seen as a troublemaker. And the same thing was also noticed during the time of Cold War. During the time of Cold War and prior to that, it was noticed that Cuba was always an ally of Soviet Union. So being an ally of the Soviet Union, they got diplomatic and financial aid and support from USSR. So in the year April 1961, the leaders of USSR, and they were worried that maybe in the years to come, the USA might invade the communist-ruled Cuba. It is to inform you all, my dear students, that Cuba was under the dominance of Soviet Union. So therefore, there was a communist government in Cuba. And the president of Cuba during that crisis was Fidel Castro. Now, the president Fidel Castro, since he was the communist leader, so the leaders of USSR, they had a fear that USA might invade the communist-ruled Cuba and might overthrow the president Castro. So that was the fear in the minds of USSR. So to overcome that fear, in the year 1962, the famous leader of USSR, Nikita Khrushchev, he placed a nuclear missile in Cuba. So there was a ballistic missile basement was established in Cuba under the banner of USSR. And the reason why they have done it, to overcome the fear of the fear of invasion in future by USA over the communist dominant Cuba. So they have established a nuclear plant in Cuba. And the reason behind it is to convert Cuba into a Russian base. So simultaneously, after 3 weeks of that event, the United States of America, that time the president was John F. Kennedy, and his advisors, diplomatic advisors, they came to know about the event of establishment of a nuclear plant in Cuba, which created a sense of tension in US because Cuba is very nearby to US, one point, and secondly, they have a fear that maybe in the near future, USSR might use Cuba for launching a nuclear war against US. So they have a fear about it. So what John F. Kennedy did to avoid the full-scale nuclear war, he tried to find out a solution. And the solution that was found by Kennedy was that he ordered the American warships to intercept any Soviet ships heading to Cuba as a way of warning the USSR. So Kennedy, therefore, he blocked the waterways through which the USSR's the ships to head towards Cuba. So they have blocked it, middle of the sea. So that's why it was a sign that USA was not supporting the move of establishment of a nuclear plant in Cuba by USSR. So this clash between USA and USSR, later period, it was came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what is Cuban Missile Crisis, my dear students? Cuban Missile Crisis is nothing but the crisis between USA and USSR regarding the establishment of a nuclear plant in Cuba. So this is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and all these things were happening during the early 1960s. Now, when we talk about the other crisis, there is another crisis that we need to discuss a bit, is the war in Korea. Now, this Korean War was happened during 1950 to 53. It is very important to mention you all that during the Second World War, after the Second World War, even in fact during the Second World War, Korea got split. One part of Korea was known as North Korea, and another part of the Korea was known as the South Korea. And the North Korea was under the dominance of China and USSR. So being dominated or influenced by China and USSR, they have developed a communist government. And in South Korea, there was a democratic government. So the clash between capitalism versus democracy, capitalism versus communism, and you can say communism versus democracy was quite evident. And during this particular period from 50 to 53, it was noticed that North Korea suddenly attacked South Korea. There was an agreement between North Korea and South Korea that they will not impede the boundary of them. And suddenly North Korea, with the encouragement made by Soviet Russia and China, they have attacked South Korea. Then South Korea sought help from United Nations of organizations, UNO, and also USA to fight back North Korea. And that's why during this particular period from 1950 to 53, there was a huge sense of fight or turmoil in Korea. During this particular period, there was a third important arena of crisis that we have noticed was the emergence of NAM. Now, what is NAM? NAM is basically a movement known as non-alignment movement. Non-aligned movement or non-alignment movement. Now, what is non-alignment movement? The details of this non-alignment movement we will discuss in the next module of our channel. But here, just let me give you a simple understanding of the terminology called non-alignment movement. Non-alignment movement has been basically understood to be as one of the important concepts where the newly emerged countries from Latin America, Asia, and South Asia, and Latin America and Africa, they have liberated from liberated from the colonial masters, mainly this British and French. So they do not want to participate in the power politics that was going on during Cold War. The reasons behind was that first, the economy was fragile. They have just independent. They do not want to be got trapped in the power politics that was going on between USA and USSR. So therefore, they want to remain neutral. They want to remain isolated from the politics that was going on. So they do not want to align with any of the power blocks led by USA and USSR. So there was the emergence of this non-alignment movement, and you will shock to know that during this particular time, most of the countries of the third world, they were supporting the non-alignment movement, and they created a third front in the Cold War, which was actually played a very important role in balancing between the Cold War politics, which was headed by USA and USSR. So these were mostly the arenas of conflict that we have noticed during the Cold War. Now, what were the consequences of these crises? We have talked about different kinds of crises are there, but mostly we have to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what were the consequences of these wars and the crisis? Now, there were four broad consequences that could be drawn. The first one is death of several army personnel and civilians. Now, in all these crises, for example, whether it is Korean crisis or Cuban Missile Crisis, or it is Vietnamian War, or Afghanistan's, war, Congo invasion. So, in all these kind of crises, it was noticed that there has been lots of people who have died. Although there was no direct confrontation between USA and USSR, but they have used these nations to showcase the power of USA and USSR. So that's why, as a result, many people had lost their lives. The second consequences was there was a huge military buildups were noticed during Cold War. Now, what is these military buildups? Military buildup basically mean establishment of different arms and ammunition centers. For example, in Cuba, we have noticed that USSR had established a nuclear plant. And the countries, they have also started piling up, not only these nuclear, arms and ammunition, but also the conventional arms and ammunitions. Missiles were being piled up. So there was a huge military buildup that was noticed as a consequences of this crisis. The third one is the diplomatic relationship between USA and USSR were completely disturbed. The kind of relationship that was noticed, the diplomatic understanding which was noticed during the Second World War, it was completely got disturbed due to these kind of crises and conflicts. The last one is that although there was a conflict, there was a piling up of nuclear energy, but one of the important consequences is that because of the piling up of nuclear energy, now each of the bloc, they have a fear that maybe in future, if they because they were capable of nuclear energy, they might be attacked by the other front or other power bloc. So therefore, the world countries or world of nations during that particular time, they do not want to go for a nuclear war. So that was another important consequence. There was a fear psychosis. People do not want to go for or confront a real sense of nuclear war during this particular period. Now, what happened afterwards? Now, due to these crises that we have seen, that discussed in the previous slides, the gap between USA and USSR, especially in terms of the suspicion, the misunderstandings between the rival groups, it got widened. So the suspicion and the misunderstanding that was, that was there between USA and USSR, it got widened. It got widened. So this widening gap between USA and USSR, this had led to two situations. The first one is piling up of nuclear and non-nuclear arms and ammunition. What does it mean? It means that because of the crisis, because of the understanding, suspicion that was going on between US and USSR, both of the countries have started, collecting more and more arms and ammunitions, both nuclear as well as non-nuclear. And the second one is there was a reluctance of both the parties in waging a direct war against each other. That is another important situation that we have noticed, that during this Cold War time, although they are piling up of lots of nuclear and non-nuclear arms and ammunition, but both of the parties do not want to wage a direct war against each other. Now, during this particular time, although the countries were trying to piling up different arms and ammunition, there were also some initiatives for arms control and disarmament. Now, we will talk about what were the initiatives taken during this arena of Cold War. We also have to understand what do we mean by arms control and disarmament. Now, when we talk about arms control and disarmament, these were two techniques adopted by the countries in order to control the growing armament or arms race between the countries. Now, as I have already told you that during this particular time, all the countries were trying to get more and more arms and ammunition. So they also had the fear that because of the piling up of arms and ammunition, maybe in future there would be another war, world war. So that fear was there. USA also had that fear and USSR also had that fear. So to overcome that fear, they have started going for a certain understanding among them. And two of the important understanding that was made at the international realm were the arms control and disarmament. Technically, both the terms were sound to be similar, but there were a little bit of difference between arms control and disarmament. As the term says, arms control basically mean to controlling the proliferation of the arms. So it basically means not to banning, but to seizing or to setting a limit of proliferation. What amount of arms a country could use. So to control the access of arms to the country. And what is disarmament? So disarmament is basically a sense of understanding of the countries to declare that they do not owe any arms and ammunition that can threat the humanity or humankind. So disarmament also means to completely stopping the piling up of arms and ammunition. So there was a disarmament basically means to disarm and means to eradicate the possibility of piling up of any kind of arms and ammunition. So these are the two techniques which were adopted during the Cold War. So these arms control and disarmament was seen to be two important measures during the arena of Cold War. Now, what were the initiatives taken during this time for arms control and disarmament? Now, here we have to talk about three important initiatives taken by these countries. The first one is called Limited Test Ban Treaty. Limited Test Ban Treaty. So this Limited Test Ban Treaty is also known as LTBT. Now it was signed in the year August 5, 1963, and it was signed by three countries, that is United States of America, Great Britain, and Soviet Russia. And it was executed in 1963, 10th October. So in 1963, August 5, it was signed, and in 10 October 1963, it was, applied. And many people consider this treaty also as a limited test ban treaty. This limited test ban treaty has to be considered as one of the first initiatives by which these three countries, they have agreed not to use nuclear arms or weapons or to exercise it in either in the airways or in water. or in the or under the water. So they have banned to using or exercising this kind of nuclear energy over the sky and also under the water. So that kind of understanding was made. The second treaty or initiative that was taken during this particular time was known as Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. And this Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was also known as NPT in short. So this particular treaty, it was signed in the year 1st July 1968. It was signed in the year 1968, 1st of July. And this treaty was signed by many countries. Earlier, it was said that almost 18 countries were the earlier signatories of this treaty. And among them, some of the popular countries are, United States of America, Soviet Russia, Britain, France, and China. Those were the first countries to sign this particular, treaty. And this treaty, later period, it has included a large number of countries under its fold. Who do not want to use nuclear energy, and they want to stop the proliferation of the nuclear energy. So that's why this treaty was signed. This is also to be considered as very important treaty that was signed during this particular period. And the third treaty which was signed was the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. This was also known as ABMT. And this ABMT was signed in 26th of May 1972. Now this particular treaty was signed between USA and USSR, and it was simply because to stop the proliferation of ballistic missiles. So that's why these kind of treaties were considered to be the measures. For example, this Limited Precedent Treaty was a nuclear disarmament policy. This NPT was a nuclear disarmament policy. And this Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was considered as the Arms Control Treaty. So these treaties were signed in order to stop the proliferation of arms and ammunition during this arena or crisis of Cold War. Now, apart from these several conflicts, there are several other initiatives which are taken. For example, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 1, SALT 1, which was signed in November 1969. Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 2, which was signed in the 2nd of November 1979. So these treaties also signed during the time of Cold War in order to overcome the possibility of proliferation of arms and ammunition. So therefore, in these particular contexts, what we learned that during the time of Cold War, the countries were under severe pressure of crisis of two ideological clash between capitalism and communism led by USA and USSR. And the crisis was felt not only among the European countries but also abroad. The other countries, including the countries from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, also got influenced by this ideological clash between USA and USSR. So, what we have learned today. So today we have learned about what do we mean by the arena of crisis, arena of Cold War, and by arena of Cold War we basically mean the crisis that occurred between USA and USSR. And which are the areas of crisis? We talked mostly about the crisis that happened between different countries. For example, we have given example of Cuban Missile Crisis. We talked about the Korean War. We talked about Vietnam War, so on and so forth. But mostly we have given importance to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then we talked about the consequences of these crises of Cold War. Then we have talked about what is the disarmament and arms control. Then we also talked about what are the initiatives taken in order to sustain arms control and disarmament during this time of crisis. So you are watching e-Politica. I hope you have understood what I am trying to deliver in this particular lecture. If you have any questions and query, please feel free to write to me at gogoi.susang@gmail.com. Till then, I am signing off. I hope that we would again meet with another module in that channel pertaining to this first unit of Class 12 Political Science, both CBSE and other syllabuses. Till then, stay home and stay safe. Jai Hind. Thank you very much.